I'm going to continue analyzing and commenting on the Ruse versus Lennox Science, Faith, and the Evidence for God discussion hosted by the Unbelievable channel. And like I tried to say in my introduction to this debate, where I covered roughly the 4 or 5 minutes that Ruse introduced himself with, what I thought was interesting about this debate, it didn't go, from my perspective, the way a normal debate goes between an atheist or agnostic or someone who's on that spectrum. As Ruse says, he's on this more of a continuum of belief, which I thought was very honest. It didn't go the way it normally goes between such a person and a Christian like Lennox. Normally, you'll have the Christian bring out the typical apologetic arguments for the existence of God and so forth, and the evidence for the existence of God, such as historical evidence, perhaps even going into scientific things like the creation of the universe, Big Bang Theory, and that sort of thing, the cosmology. And then the atheist or agnostic will kind of shoot all those down and poke all the holes that they can in those, because you can poke holes in all of those things, typically. But instead, this guy, Michael Ruse, kept basically crying out to Lennox, you have to have faith, right? And Lennox kept emphasizing the evidence he has for his beliefs, evidentiary belief, justified belief, right? Now, I expected Lennox to do that, and Lennox does this very well. I really like whenever I see him speak. But I did not expect Ruse to be emphasizing faith so much, and he'll go on to emphasize some more interesting things that I've been sort of thinking about with my Fearful Symmetry series regarding William Blake and Northrop Frye. And this is going to bleed over into what I'm talking about with Jordan Peterson and what I call the Jordan Peterson Paradox. And it also flows very nicely into McGilchrist, if you're familiar with his book, The Master and His Emissary. I think it's a great companion book to Maps of Meaning and to Jordan Peterson in general. I think McGilchrist and Jordan Peterson need to talk more, and they need to do more long-form discussions. You know, they did a 30-minute sit-down. They need to do a 3-hour sit-down. Jordan's done, what, 3 or 4 with Rogan right now, and some other people with Rogan. But, you know, why hasn't he sat down with McGilchrist for 3 hours? That's what I want to know. And, you know, why isn't McGilchrist going out on tour with him? That would be amazing. But anyway, so if you want to think of this perhaps in a McGilchrist way, what you're going to see is Michael Ruse over here acting almost like the right hemisphere, talking about faith and this sort of relational attitude or disposition towards the world. And then you have, which seems, you know, it seems like the atheist side of the debate would not be talking about that, but he does. And then Lennox over here seems to be taking well, he is a mathematician, so, but see, mathematics, of course, it goes over both hemispheres, and nothing is so neatly divided in the brain. It varies in the way in which it does these things. So as the mathematician, he's emphasizing the evidence and for his beliefs and so forth. And so let's just get right into it and watch. I want you to watch this debate as two sides of the brain talking to each other on how to go forward, to best go forward, living in the world, regarding having justified beliefs and so forth. And I also want you to look at this as not, them talking against each other or trying to overcome each other's positions, but rather look at it as how you can have the best position possible as the two men are trying to get to the same place, let's say. And as a Christian, you can use what Michael Ruse is saying to your advantage. And I think that's what Jordan Peterson ultimately is going to be doing, and I'm going to get to that as I continue this series of Jordan Peterson Paradox video series.
you to reveal exactly what age you are, but do you feel that, looking back...
78, 78. And my wife's 56.
A man, he's broken the cardinal rule of every husband. I was going to ask, though, I mean, do you feel like you could still be persuaded that...
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't think, first of all, and I think this is where John and I are going to disagree very strongly, is I'm not very keen on being persuaded in the sense of, is there some evidence that would tip you over to whatever?
I thought this was interesting. He comes out swinging, so to speak, with humor, and he gets the crowd on his side with jokes. And I think being lighthearted when it comes to these discussions is very important. Not that you're disrespecting the person you're talking with or the material itself, but that you pursue your discussions with joy. And, you know, laughter and jokes are vital to that. And that's why I think the whole deal with Owen Benjamin and Jordan Peterson and that kind of community is really telling and interesting, because we need the comedians, we need laughter, and there's a certain side to our society that it's trying to extinguish comedy. It's trying to put out all the comedians, and you just can't have a society that can't laugh at itself and at anything. You know, that's what you couldn't laugh in Stalinist Russia, right? That's the difference between America and freedom and not having any freedom. Is you know, who can you poke fun at? Who can you laugh at? So anyway, he uses humor to his advantage, and I think that's interesting. And he says he's not going to be convinced by evidence, and I think that's very interesting, because someone else said that before in one of these debates. I forget who, but right away they said, they started off the debate saying their minds can't be changed, and no evidence would convince them. And it sort of reminds me of Hume's position, ruling out supernatural things, and it sort of puts you in an epistemological bubble. And so everything that is, quote, supernatural, or that doesn't fit your certain criteria of belief, is filtered out by this shimmering bubble and epistemological bubble. So what you can know is only that which is within your bubble, and that's something that you constructed yourself, and you're keeping everything outside at bay that you don't want to deal with. And I don't think that's the proper way of going about having a debate or discussion or anything like that, or life itself. You have to be open to the possibility of something new, something that you haven't considered, even something you don't believe in. Should be open to you as a possibility. So I'm going to let him continue on there. So if he's not convinced by evidence, what might convince him?
I could certainly see some experience might fill me with faith. I don't expect it to happen, but that's the only way that I could see it happening.
Thank you for joining us, both Michael and John, for what I'm sure will be...
So he says what could convince him, it's not going to be evidence, but perhaps some kind of experience. So this is like Saul on the road to Damascus. He has an experience, a religious experience, and this vision, this experience is what changes him and convinces him that he should change his ways. And so at least Michael Ruse is open to that much, if not evidence, as John Lennox is going to try to provide evidence, which will seemingly be of little use to this man because he's looking for experience. At least he does have one option open to him, and that is experience.
It'll be a fascinating discussion. We've got lots of ground that we want to cover, but we'll just see where we go in the conversation. I mean, I think it is a little bit significant that we're meeting here at the Institution for Mechanical Engineers, founded by George and Robert Stephenson in 1847, very much building on the fruits of the scientific revolution, which gave us so much of what we enjoy today. I suppose my starting question is, though, when it comes to modern science, do you both share a kind of view that it does owe something to the Judeo-Christian sort of foundations, if you like, of Britain and the West? What's your view on that, John?
I think very much so. I remember as a teenager being subjected by a friend to reading Alfred North Whitehead, and he's a difficult philosopher, as you know, but I remember coming across the notion that the rise of modern science was due to the rational insistence, the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. And then later, reading C.S. Lewis, who summed it up in slightly easier language, he said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. So
I think that's very important to understand, and I'm going to get to that in my human accomplishment video series. I'm going to cover the Aristotelian principle, and then I'm going to get to, finally, Thomas Aquinas. And what Lennox just laid out there is essential, and it's essentially what Aquinas kind of put forward. And I think he added one little other bit to it, and that it was morally permissible to pursue science, and it was a good thing. And once it became a good thing and morally permissible, and you had the structure for believing that there is a lawgiver, that there are laws, that there's some kind of way to understand, a rational way to understand how the world works. You know, all of these things sort of mesh one against each other until you have a sort of modern scientific understanding of the world layered over time. And I've actually been reading a couple of books suggested to me by some of you, and I've just found them really interesting. I'm so glad you all suggested them, because I wouldn't have picked them up by myself. I took that leap of faith here, and I decided to read what you've suggested. And one of the books was An Introduction to Christianity by Ratzinger, and I'm loving that book more than I ever imagined I might. And I'm going to use some of it to explain the next bits of this video. In this video, I think we're going to get to the 30-minute mark, roughly speaking, of this debate. And then for the second half of the debate, I'm going to bring in Ratzinger's book, Introduction to Christianity. And another book that was suggested was The Theology of Karl Barth by his friend Balthasar, and a Catholic theologian. And there's just a bit from that I want to get into as well regarding this. And so I'm going to bring in two books that you guys recommended to me, and I'm really having a good time with. And again, thank you for suggesting those books, and we'll get back to this debate now.
In one sense, I am delighted to be both a scientist, if you allow a mathematician to say he's a scientist, which is another matter, and a believer in God, because arguably it was the Christian cradle that gave birth to my subject. And I noticed, of course, subsequently, many people who weren't necessarily Christian, like Melvin Calvin, who won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, and he said, as I look back to ask where this belief in order came from, that's fundamental to all science. In fact, it's the fundamental faith of scientists. We can't do science unless we look for order in nature. He says that it came from an idea first mooted by the ancient Hebrews and then communicated later in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And John Hedley Brooke, who was an expert historian of science, is perhaps, well, he is more nuanced than I would be and a little bit more cautious, but nevertheless, the tenor of the argument is that certainly there's a deep connection for a very obvious reason. If you believe that behind the universe there's a rational mind, then you expect to be able to do science. So that I would put the two together quite strongly.
Well,
something that's interesting that you'll find in Charles Murray's book about human accomplishment, and something Lennox just touched on, often the writers of these kinds of books are very careful and cautious about how they're writing, for obvious reasons, right? I think Murray was was run off of a campus a few months ago. But you can't, of course, do an experiment as to why societies and civilizations develop something like science or this scientific revolution. But you can compare various aspects of the different societies and different regions and places and times, and you can say, you know, well, is it wealth? And then you can test the wealth hypothesis, and is it peace? And you can test that, and I've gone over that in my human accomplishment videos. But nowhere in the world did you get what we would consider as modern people science developed to the extent that you had it developed in Western Europe. And there's a cultural explanation for that. And I'm going to get into that, like I said, again, with the Thomas Aquinas book. It has to do with what Lennox is saying, is that we had a culture that made it okay to look after order in the universe, and we supposed there was order. Like he said, it came from the Hebrew idea that there was a God creating order out of chaos, and this God constructed the universe, the world. So, and then, you know, from there it got morphed into the Greek New Testament, and there's some slight modifications happening there. But then you come to the Logos, and the Logos again is about this order and this truth that exists. And again, I'm going to touch on that in the next part of this this commentary series on the Peterson Paradox.
Firstly, do you agree that there is a sort of Judeo-Christian heritage that has informed the modern science? But also, how far do you go along John's line that an orderly science presupposes a sort of orderly mind at some level behind it?
Well, I think it has done in the past. Yes, first of all, I agree with John. I think that modern science owes a great... I mean, you know, we want to say we've got to be broad and we've got to bring in Buddhism and all of these, but the simple fact of the matter is modern science owes basically its being to Christianity. I mean, at least the science that we have, and I'm sure we'll talk about Darwinism, and I would say it owes its being to Anglican Christianity. But certainly, I think that you're quite right to say that modern science...
Not to interrupt him too often, but I do have to interrupt this kind of often to provide a fair use of this video. Otherwise, I might get a strike on my channel. So he talks about the Anglican version of Christianity. And if you know anything about the different sects, the Anglican Church is pretty much like it's about almost as secular as you can get as far as a church goes. It's really a strange thing. I guess there's historical reasons for that, but I won't get into that right now. But that's why, you know, Darwin was from an Anglican background, and this perhaps gave him, I guess, according to Ruse, a sort of intellectual freedom to pursue something that might be outside the bounds of what the church might think.
John and I were talking just before. We both took, well, you took courses with her, and I was very much influenced by a woman called Mary Hesse, who was a professor at Cambridge at philosophy. And she made a great deal of metaphor. And I've bought into this, hook, line, and sinker, that I don't think that science is just, like Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Science is interpretation. Mm-hmm. Science is the facts as you put them together and make sense of it. And I think the key is metaphor.
So here's the interesting thing. This is why I said at the beginning, look at this as Ruse somewhat being the right hemisphere of the brain, if you want to think of it in McGilchrist terms. And he's talking about metaphor. And who else talked about metaphor? Well, I talk about it pretty much constantly on the channel, and that's because I'm influenced by William Blake, by Northrop Frye. And there's a part of Christianity that does emphasize the symbolism and the metaphor, but you can't overemphasize it. And I think this is where you need both Ruse here and Lennox. You need them both to work properly in the world. And this is what I think Jordan Peterson and the Peterson Paradox is about. The idea, as he's often gone over, the order and the chaos, right? The left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, the mathematical and the linguistic, the literal and the metaphorical. Okay, we're getting into these are different layers, right? The literal and the metaphorical, and how are these things merging? They're merging obviously it's all linguistic, but when you say literal, then you seem to have a referential truth. You're starting to refer to something out there in the world, a correspondence theory of truth. But again, I'm going to get more heavily into that in the third part of this video. I just wanted to remind you, just to refresh your memory, that look at Ruse talking like the right hemisphere, talking about metaphor, talking like William Blake, and he's going to start talking about faith. Why is the atheist here talking about faith and the importance of faith? Again, look at them not as arguing or debating, but I see them really as both adding to the Christian worldview and the way a Christian ought to think about these things, just as I think Jordan Peterson is also right on the verge of something along this stance, which I kind of alluded to in the first Peterson Paradox video.
Now, up until the scientific revolution, the key metaphor, that what linguists call the root metaphor, was that of an organism. The world was seen as organic. I mean, Plato in the Timaeus comes right out with that, but Aristotle too. I think there was a change of metaphor. I'm not saying anything that John Hedley Brooke and others wouldn't say. There was a change in metaphor to that of a machine. Now, of course, to a certain extent, it was fueled by the fact that we now had more and more sophisticated machines, and particularly clocks. I mean, this was the big one. So I think that more and more in the scientific revolution, the world was being looked at as a machine made by the divine engineer. And what happened was this became tremendously powerful by the end of the 16th and certainly into the 17th century. You read people like Robert Boyle and all of these others. They're using the machine metaphor all the time. The thing was, though, that more and more people found, as much as doing science was concerned, God wasn't very helpful. That, to use the language of today, you just had to get on with being a methodological naturalist and leave, as it were, metaphysical naturalism, the question of God or no God, out. And as one of the great historians of the scientific revolution said, eventually God became a retired engineer.
Going to cut in again so that again I can have a fair use of this video. He's talking about how the metaphor changed, and we began to think of human beings as machines, as our technological expertise rose, and we started creating machines on more and more sophisticated levels ourselves. Then we started to change the metaphor to view ourselves as a machine. And if you go back to my Akira the Don's Watts Wave 4 music analysis, the first 3 tracks there, you'll hear Alan Watts talk about how the Chinese conceptualized the world as an organism, and the Hindus sort of conceptualized God as sort of a dramatist, acting out in the world, playing in the world. And the Greeks, or the Christians specifically, had a God that was a constructor God, the great engineer, as Ruse just said.
When they started with the machine, of course, it was looked at in terms of this is good, who was the divine creator. But as I say, I think as the years went by, it wasn't because people were necessarily irreligious. Many of them, like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, were very religious. But they found increasingly, as scientists, it wasn't necessary, and it wasn't very helpful to bring God into the discussion. Descartes says this. Now, the fact is, they wanted to go on believing in God, but it started to make the way possible for what Richard Dawkins has called, you could be an intellectually justified atheist. They were not atheists in the 17th century, but it was the thin end of a very big wedge.
Do you agree with that assessment, John?
Now, do you ever hear Sam Harris talk about the scientific revolution in that way? Freely admitting that to a large degree, many of these men were believers. They weren't atheist scientists being persecuted, and they weren't closet atheists necessarily. But here's an atheist saying, you know what? Yeah, many of them were believers, and their belief certainly spurred on their curiosity to figure out how the world worked, because they assumed the world did work in a certain way. It had laws and so forth, as Lennox said.
To a certain extent, I think we have to recognize as well that it depends what area of your science you're talking about. I'm a pure mathematician, and when I teach pure mathematics, I don't mention God at all. And if I was designing the rocket locomotive that George Stephenson designed, we don't mention God at all. God doesn't arise in the vast amount of the practicalities of science, even biology. Where the deeper questions come are, why can we do science at all? What is it about this universe that allows us to do science? And there I would begin to see the fingerprint of a divine mind. So that it's not so much in the mechanisms. Now, there are exceptions to that, because when you raise questions of origins, inevitably, if you look at the history of ideas, you'll see that the question of God comes up a great deal. And God as the one who creates the universe and sustains it. But you'll not find God at the bottom of the piston cylinder in an automobile engine. And of course you won't.
And that's very important to understand. And if you listen to the way Ruse said it, you might misunderstand things. And of course, a lot of people who listen to Sam Harris perhaps understood him mistakenly to think that, to think the way Lennox just clarified, that, oh, you're going to find God in every little bit of science that you look into. You're going to see this creator or designer or something. And that's not the case. And what Lennox is saying is that it's about the presupposition of science. That's where you find God. And it's more about the philosophy of science. And I'm going to bring in Heidegger in the next part of this analysis as well, because he has an interesting thing, well, quite a few interesting things to say about truth and what science is doing in trying to reveal the truth. He says science is not actually revealing the truth in itself or of itself. It's only reveals sort of qualities and stuff. It doesn't get to the thing in itself, right?
And the danger is that because that kind of practical science was so successful in spinning off technology, people then began to take what I regard as a completely illegitimate step, and that is to do away with God altogether. And the main reason for that is the notion that science cannot answer every question.
Right, and that gets into scientism. Scientism says that science does answer every question. And I've talked to many people through, let's say, Facebook or something, and it's astonishing how many average people just think that science has all the answers. And when I point out that the notion or the statement, science has all the answers, or science can explain everything or whatever, that's not science, that's philosophy. And so Heidegger pointed out, this was one of Heidegger's worries as well, that we went into technology, and he goes into the Greek roots of this and how that relates to truth, and that sort of our expertise excelled and sort of, went out of control, so to speak, because the other part of our experiencing truth or finding truth in wisdom and experience and so forth slowed down, and we sort of eliminated it almost altogether. And this is also brought up in, it's funny because I'm reading all these three books at once, and they're sort of all circumambulating this one point. It's brought up in Introduction to Christianity by Ratzinger as well, and he's bringing up Heidegger just as I'm reading it in one of Heidegger's essays. How it's almost like Jordan Peterson's concern that we've, and here again, here's the other link, Jordan Peterson comes into this, that he's concerned that we're moving too quickly ahead with our modern scientific understanding of the world and of ourselves, unconscious of how dependent we are on meaning and the sort of old traditional way of seeking truth and wisdom in God, in religion, in these texts. And if we're unaware of that, if we leave that behind, it's to our peril, as he says, right?
Scientism is rampant today, and I think it's dangerously false.
Just explain what scientism is.
Well, it's the idea that science is the only way to truth. And of course, as a statement, if I say science is the only way to truth, that's logically self-contradictory, because that statement is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. Perhaps it's a bit too early in the evening for logic like that. But the point is this, that many people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking regard science as the only way to truth. Well, that would shut down your department of philosophy, and that would be absurd. And Cambridge Philosophy Department reacted very severely to Hawking's statement.
Before Michael comes back on this, I'd just be interested in you teasing a bit open the idea of why can we do science at all? That big question. Because as a mathematician, do you agree with, I think it was Eugene Wigner who said, the universe is written in the language of mathematics. He said he talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
Yes, that's a famous 1961 paper that all mathematicians love. But he was wrong, you see.
Oh, okay.
Because the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics assumes a naturalist philosophy. It is absolutely unreasonable that mathematics works if you assume an atheist or naturalistic philosophy. But if you believe there's a God whose mind is behind this universe and behind our minds, then the effectiveness of mathematics is something that I would expect. And of course, Newton, being the genius that he was, this was one of his evidences when he wrote Principia Mathematica. He wrote at the beginning of it, he hoped a thinking person would see that there was a deity from his descriptions of the universe. Kepler said similar things.
What do you make of that idea that the very order of the universe, the fact that we do maths, that the way we discover the world is written in the language of mathematics in the universe, is that in any way pointing beyond itself, as John obviously thinks, towards some kind of divine mind?
Well, of course, as a philosopher, I'm going to say it depends what you mean by. No, I want to make three responses to the line that John's pushing. The first is, I feel I'm getting into one of these discussions like, have you stopped beating your wife? As soon as you say yes, you say, well, why did you beat her in the first place? If you say no, then you say, well, maybe you should. It's the fallacy of complex question. And I'm a little worried that we're already being driven into arguments about proofs for the existence of God. I like to describe myself as a very conservative non-believer. And I am not that keen on natural theology at that sort of way. I think that religious belief, certainly Christian belief, should be based on faith. I'm with Cardinal Newman on this. He said, I believe in design because I believe in God. I do not believe in God because I believe in design. So,
really interesting that this is what the atheist is talking about on stage. It's actually kind of rare in Christian apologetics that you even hear a Christian talk this way, because they almost feel like it's not going to be convincing to someone who doesn't already believe. I think what's interesting here, again, almost paradoxical, is that I think it's the atheist and the non-believer, or let's say the cultural Christian who only goes to church once with their family on Christmas or once on Easter or something, who's not too familiar and too steeped in the language. Maybe they are familiar enough to understand someone talking in the language of faith. I think that might be important. But let's say they're not. Let's say they're not even that familiar. They go to church, but that one time a year, 2 times a year, but they don't even pay attention. So, you know, they're 20 or they're 25, and they don't even know the language of faith. I know some people like that. So it's not a ridiculous assumption that you can go to church and still not understand the language of faith. And so that person, I think, is almost in a better position than the Christian when it comes to understanding some of these things, because the Christian is sort of swimming in it, It's the Christian is like the fish in the ocean. The Christian doesn't realize all of the wonder and awe around them because they're just always surrounded by it. But someone who's sort of just opening their eyes to it, just opening their ears to it for the first time, they're sort of exposed to it, and then they can see it for what it is. And I think C.S. Lewis sort of touched on this with his idea that, maybe logic and reason, as commonplace as we think of it, maybe that's actually the supernatural, that which is above nature. That's how we sort of make nature into something productive and into something wonderful. And that may go against some people's views that there's just nature does provide wonder and awe and beauty, and to some extent, but by and large, everywhere in nature, and this is Blake's view and Northrop Frye, that there's just, I think I went over it in my Fearful Symmetry video series, everywhere that there's nature, there's just havoc, chaos, death, and destruction, basically. The animal dies in the woods, and then the worms come for it, and it's decay, it's plants growing up through the corpse and so forth, and it's not a pretty thing. It's certainly not, it's not good for a human being to just be out in the state of nature. That's why we create civilization, and that's why we create what we do create using our rational minds. We create something that no other animals can create because of this reason, because of this, perhaps, this supernatural gift and ability that C.S. Lewis talks about. And, even if you don't buy into that, it's worth thinking about it in a new way. It's worth considering it from a new perspective, because, like I said, sometimes we as Christians can be sitting in this ocean and never see all the water around us, right? We just don't hear it, we don't see it because we're so steeped in it. And so sometimes I envy the person who can just hear it for the first time and have that awakening, and then just start to hear and see all of these great things for the first time. It sort of happened to me, I guess, when I started reading Blake again and started to hear things from a sort of different angle, a different side of things, and I started to see things a little bit more clearly and differently, and it was sort of an awe-inspiring kind of thing to read all of Blake's poetry. But here, I'll continue on with this, and so you can hear more of the debate. Like I said, I want to get to around minute 30 or so. I think that's where a shift in the debate happens.
That's my first sort of statement I would want to make about that. The second one is, well, if it is design, then you've got some questions to ask about the nature of the designer. I mean, the Richard Dawkins type questions. Well, who designed God? I mean, and you're going to have to say something like, well, no, God is a necessary being, and that's going to get you into, I'm not saying insoluble questions to do with the nature of existence, but at least some. I mean, take, for instance, Oliver Roos sitting on the front bench. It is possibly conceivable that my wife and I had only 2 children. We jumped from Emily down to Edward, and Oliver was just, a flash in the pan, or wasn't even, well, not even, what do they say, a dirty glint in his father's eye. So in other words, Oliver does exist, but he doesn't have to exist. Whereas, of course, I think that John's God, at some level, has to exist. The third point I'd want to make is if we do have a designer, what is this designer? John and I, before we came in, as 2 old men tend to do, we were swapping stories about, I'm more gravely ill than you are, sort of thing. I'm going to collapse on stage before you do. But I mean, let's take something that neither of us brought up, hemorrhoids. My father had them. I can't believe that any God who cared a bit about human beings would have invented a world which allowed hemorrhoids. So I think if you're going to get into design, then you've got to take the rough with the smooth, as it were. And so I think there are all sorts of issues like that.
There's 3 issues to get us going.
See, he's cutting me off.
So here again, Ruse uses some humor to get his points across, and I touched on this in the Fearful Symmetry series again, the point about how we're made. And Fry says we're fearfully and wonderfully made. But there are some discrepancies with our making, and there's some interesting things Blake has to say about this as well. So Blake, he'll refer to the human being as it's made as a worm. When you're thinking about it rationally, from the purely rationalistic perspective. And the other interesting thing that Fry brings up regarding Blake and this sort of thing is that once you are whole, when you're using your rational side, but also your irrational side, your unconscious and your conscious minds, and you start to think more clearly about it, the fact that you are sort of a fallen creature, let's say, should point you to, as Barth says, it's a signpost. It's not the thing in and of itself. It points you to the thing of itself. It points you to God. It points you to an unfallen nature. You have an imagination that can imagine how it can be otherwise. And to me, that's a huge sign that what we are is metaphor. And I go over this in the Epistemology and Metaphor video. It's like my longest video. It goes over an essay by Nietzsche, and by the conclusion, I'm trying to develop this idea, and I'm still developing it, that of all the things that we are as people, one of the things we are is a metaphor. Okay, and Ruse brings it up in a humorous way. I don't think Lennox answers it this way. But remember, Ruse is emphasizing the importance of metaphor, and now the answer to his question is metaphor, but he doesn't quite see it. So that's my only criticism of him so far regarding this small point here.
Cutting me off already.
I
was told not to bring those sorts of examples up.
Well, if you're happy, shall we start at least with one of those and see where?
I'd like to start with all three.
So, as if memory serves, there's the question of natural theology.
Yes.
Michael doesn't like that. He thinks if you're going to believe on the basis of faith alone, not some speculation about the universe. There's this question of, well, where did God come from in the first place? And then there's this question of why, if it's a designer, why hemorrhoids? So, yes.
Right. Well, to take the first one, it's quite clear that Michael and I differ fundamentally on what we mean by faith. Because you see, faith to me is part and parcel of my life as an intellectual and a scientist. Scientists believe certain things. I believe in the theory of gravitational.
So now here Lennox is going to play the role you usually see in this kind of apologetic debate by the Christian, is that he's going to say, well, actually, my beliefs are based on evidence because I'm no fool, and I'm not turning my brain off as a Christian. I'm turning it up higher than you may think, and I consider all the possibilities while you only consider some. Now, there is a point to that, and I agree to a certain extent regarding his points. I think he makes them very well. But again, I think he has to, and we have to consider the other side as well, the metaphorical side, the symbolic side of things as well. Not just the literal, not just the historical. And like I said, I've been reading that book by Ratzinger, The Introduction to Christianity. He has some really great stuff in there regarding how we're coming to this notion of belief. Because so far the part that I read, he's talking about credo, the I believe part of the creed, the very start of it, and what does the belief mean? And I also touched on this in my Jordan as if Peterson, how he always says, I act as if God exists. So I did a short video on that, about 10 minutes long, and quoting what McGilchrist said, as if means, living as if, and what belief means. And it's about your disposition towards the world. It's a relational belief. It's the kind of way you interact between you and another person, you and a personality, you and a living thing, a living being. not you, and facts. So there's person, let's say there's different kinds of knowledge, and I go into this a little bit with of course, the metaphor and epistemology video, but I'm going to emphasize it again and again in these upcoming videos because it's very important to understanding the Peterson Paradox. There's certain kinds of knowledge. There's people knowing, and there's fact knowing. And it's kind of hard to say that in English, but other languages, they have different words for these different types of knowing. And so you might not be familiar with that. You might not have heard that before if you're an English speaker, but I'm just hyphenating those words, people knowing and fact knowing, and then I add some other ones that McGilchrist doesn't add, but he does talk about how they relate to one another. There's music knowing, which is we relate to music like we relate to people, regarding our brain activity and how we think about music, and the attributes we give to music. They're very much the same things attributes we give to people. And they're relational attributes. And so there's people knowing, fact knowing, and regarding the fact knowing, I would add in something slightly different, object knowing. And so from fact knowing and object knowing and sense data, we start to develop science. From people knowing and music knowing, we start to develop this relational idea of religion and theology, and then language has its role. I think I might put up a big diagram about this. I've been thinking about it, but I don't know what purpose it might serve. But maybe me just saying it, you're very confused by it, and maybe you need a picture for that, to sort of see how everything sort of fits into the system here. And then so once you have language sort of feeds back onto these things. Language feeds back onto your fact knowing and your object knowing, which is creating your science. And it's the language itself is also developing your fact knowing and your object knowing. So it's sort of they sort of feed on each other, and they're self-constructing and reconstructing each other. And the same goes for your people knowing and music knowing and your religion and your theology. And that language is also redeveloping your ideas about people knowing and music knowing and God knowing. God knowing develops out of that linguistically. And then there are linguistic problems, which have linguistic solutions. And metaphor, as McGilchrist points out, is one of the solutions for a linguistic problem that we have. But I think I kind of went on a tangent there that I should save for another video that's specifically about that kind of thing.
Attraction, why is that? Because I've evidence for it. I believe that my wife loves me. Why? Because I've evidence for it. And my Christian faith consists not in faith as a leap into the unknown. It's evidence-based commitment. Otherwise, I wouldn't be remotely interested in Christianity. And I notice that Richard Dawkins' faith is heavily evidence-based. That's why he writes a 400-page book called The God Delusion. So I think we've a fundamental difference about faith. And secondly, I didn't use the word proof, Michael. I'm too much a mathematician to use the word proof. I think it's a question of evidence. It's very interesting to me that when Paul talks about the impact of the universe, he says that the existence of God and his power are perceived through the things that are made. It's a perception. And what intrigues me is that perception is admitted by so many people that you would think would not admit it. Dawkins says it's terribly tempting to believe that it's designed. Stephen Hawking co-authors a book called The Grand Design. Why? Because he sees design. And then there comes all the arguments that I don't find convincing to say, well, it's not real design, it's only apparent design. So that's the first thing. My faith is an evidence-based commitment. Secondly, the question of who designed the designer. And Richard Dawkins put that to me, and it's the heart of the God delusion argument. If you say God created the universe, then you have to ask who created God. Well, do you? Because if you ask the question, who or what created X, then you're assuming that X was created. But the biblical God wasn't created, so the question doesn't even apply to him. So it's one of these questions that you think is asking something seriously important, but it misses the point. And I actually put it to Dawkins in the end. I said, your question makes no sense apart from about created things. But I don't need you to tell me that created gods are a delusion. Most of us think they are. We call them idols. But I said, let me try your question on you. You believe the universe created you. So if your question is valid, let me ask you it. Who created your creator?
I really liked that retort he gave to Dawkins. And I liked what he said about, we know that created gods are delusions. We call them idols. I thought that was a wonderful little phrase there, a way of describing that. I'm not quite sure it works technically, but it does give a good impression if you're talking to an audience. And he's a very eloquent speaker, and certainly, you know, a genius mathematician can get away with certain things that a regular person can't when they're speaking about such things.
I've waited 10 years and got no answer to that.
Before you come to part 3, because the hemorrhoids question is really a question of evil, and I think I'm going to park that, and perhaps we'll come back to it a bit later on. But we've got plenty to talk about.
Which means it's not.
No. I do want to address it, but at least with these first 2 issues, and John's responses there, Michael, what's your take?
Well, I particularly want to talk about the first one, this whole question of evidence-based. And what exactly does that mean? If, for instance, somebody tells me, as I was taught by my physics master when I was at school, if I'm told that Galileo's laws work or something like that, and then the physics master says, well, let's do some experiments to show you exactly how this sort of thing does, and we swing some pendulums back and forth and that sort of thing. Now, I take it that that's an evidence-based belief that I'm going to go away with, that missiles go in parabolas rather than in circles or regular circles or something like that. Now that I see as evidence-based. Now let's go back to the whole question of God. As I said, I don't want to take evidence out of the story, but I'm worried about evidence being used to justify these beliefs in God. I believe in design because I believe in God. I do not believe in God because I believe in design. Whereas I think in the physics case, I do believe in Galileo's laws because I believe that the physical evidence was there. So it seems to me obvious that any Christian is going to look at the world and interpret the world in an evidence-based way. I mean, for instance, think about the difference between Heinrich Himmler and Sophie Scholl, who died on the guillotine because she was a member of the White Rose group in Munich. Surely anybody who's a Christian is going to interpret these actions, and it's going to be evidence-based in that sort of sense, that yes, that I see here's a case of a person who is made in the image of God, and that's what makes them evil. If they were just a wild dog, they would be dangerous, but they wouldn't be evil. Whereas as a Christian, I would see Heinrich Himmler as deeply evil, whereas I'd see Sophie Scholl as transcendently good. So it's evidence-based in that sense, but it's not proving my beliefs. My beliefs are something that I have through faith. It really is a question, folks, of Saul on the way to Damascus. Saul was not, met by somebody who says, by the way, Saul, I'd like to introduce you to the ontological argument.
So it's very interesting that he brings this up. I think it's almost counterproductive to his argument, but to say that these two, you have one case, Heinrich Himmler, who's really, quite evil, only if you have the presuppositions of a Christian, then you're looking at the world through the Christian lens, and there you can spot the man who's evil and the woman who's good. But if you don't have that lens through which to look at the world, and you're looking at it in an atheistic lens, through an atheistic lens, you're not going to find Himmler as evil, nor that, I forget the woman he said, Sophie something or other, as good. And I think that's kind of damning, because most people will find that jarring, and they're going to find out, they're going to feel Like, that's not the way the world is. That's not how I see the world. And, you know, Sam Harris will say, well, that's because of, you know, you have all this stuff culturally built into you. But maybe it's something more than that. And this is, again, Jordan Peterson talking about exactly how we build up these structures to filter the world, and how stories play an evolutionary role in shaping our civilization and shaping our cultures, our societies, and us as individuals. And so there's sort of a biological aspect to it, and there's a psychological aspect to it. And it's interesting how psychology sort of bridges the gap almost between religion and science. And an interesting thing I found about Jung is that he said that he was a doctor of the soul, or something along those lines, where he treated people's souls, the psyche, from the Greek, you know, the Greek root of psyche. So Jordan Peterson, in a way, is sort of bridging that gap between science and religion, things that are supposed to be at odds with one another. And as he says in Maps of Meaning, that's because their domains have not been sufficiently delimited. And so yet he's bringing them together through psychology. He's informing, he's shedding light on how we come to believe what we believe, and he's using our belief. He's using Christianity because he thinks that's the clearest example of this, the best example. He's using Christianity sort of like a torchlight, going into the depths of our psyche and saying, look, here is the human soul. Here is this is how it's built from the ground up, and he's building this structure from the ground up that bridges the material world and this religious world that's the sort of supernatural, non-material world. I think that's, again, one of the reasons why it's sort of paradoxical to us, that we feel there's something going on here that's perhaps not right, or perhaps unusual. Perhaps it's giving us the signal that it's paradoxical. And again, this is part of the reason why I'm exploring it in this video series, starting with the Peterson Paradox video I did a couple of weeks ago.
I think, you know, if we spend a couple of hours talking this one through, or we talk about the argument from design, and Saul says, you know, you're right, I'm on the way to Damascus, and now I believe in God. It didn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. It's the gift of God. That's the basis of Christianity.
But hang on, Michael. Hang on. You see, Paul was convinced. What was the evidence? An appearance of the risen Christ. That's what started Christianity. It was the appearance of the risen Christ and the fact that there was evidence of the other kind for his resurrection that launched Christianity on the world. And I'm intrigued by your example, the moral example you gave. You see, you mentioned what I would call testability. You can test Newton's laws and all this kind of thing. And I'm constantly up against the question, how can you as a scientist believe this stuff when it's not testable? And I say, who said it isn't testable? You see, why am I sitting here as a Christian? Because I've tested the claims that Christ has made.
I found this kind of jarring when he said that he's tested the claims that Christ has made. I never thought about it as testing it, and I certainly never thought about it as a scientific test of it. And I'm sure this is stretching the meaning of testing and scientific testing and all that kind of thing. But it's still interesting that he brought it up, and that he's, you know, forcefully saying it as, you know, this is why he believes. And if it wasn't the case, he would not believe in Christianity. And that, I think, is also very interesting and very telling as to how much weight he gives this evidence, how much historical evidence plays into this. This is where you're going to get into N.T. Wright. I'm going to bring him, you know, into this a little bit in my next video, because of the historical evidence of the resurrection. It all comes back, you know, down to this resurrection between these two men, and between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and everybody else. All the Christian believers want to know what Jordan thinks about this resurrection. It seems to be, you know, the most important issue. Well, for anybody, you know, not just Jordan Peterson. It's for everybody. So, you know, and why is it so important? Why is history playing such an important role? Why is science constantly being brought up with regard to something that happened, 2,000 years ago, supposedly. And what other ways can we think about the resurrection? I'm going to get into some of this stuff in the next part of this video, and I might only be able to cover maybe 10 or 15 minutes into this this next part of the debate, as I'm bringing in, like I said, a couple of other books, a couple of other thinkers, to help us explore this idea of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Let me give you one simple example. We might want to deal with this later on, I don't know, but Christ promises that those who trust him and receive him will receive peace with God and forgiveness and a new life and a new power. I've seen that happen to me and to people endless times. And when you see 2 and 2 make 4 all the time, you begin to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. I think it's eminently testable. And so, to come back on Michael's side for a moment, I think there are different levels of argument, Michael. You mentioned testing laws in the laboratory, but there are many things in science, as we know, that are not testable. You can't test the origin of life in the lab. You have to make an inference to the best explanation in the past. And that is true of many things. So for me, the evidence on which my faith is based is cumulative. Part of it is objective, intellectual, arguments and all this kind of thing. But a great deal of it has to do with the evidence of, does it actually work in life?
Why doesn't that satisfy you, this
Well, there's a couple of things I want to say. I think that John and I probably have a very different take on the resurrection. I have a feeling that for you, John, proving that it actually happened physically is very important to you. And you're the sort of person who says, well, look at the fact that it was women who reported on this, and women would not normally take it, so this must be significant and all, must be true. Whereas, as a conservative non-believer, I think the physical resurrection is totally unimportant. I think that what is important is that those disciples on the third day who were downcast, who felt that seeing this man, put to death in the most horrible way, suddenly said, our Creator lives. And that was within them. Whether there were laws to prove this, I think is irrelevant. So as I say, I take my religion much more at a spiritual level.
I thought you were the atheist.
I said, if I did, I'm very good.
So again, there's a little bit of humor there brought in by the host and Michael Ruse. Of course, it's a very serious thing. It's, did the bodily resurrection of Jesus happen or not? But they're able to talk about it with some levity here. And this will be the topic of the next part of the video, but I'm going to give some background on it in the next part of this video series. Again, using Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity and using that book about Karl Barth's theology and so forth. And so there's going to be maybe 20 or 30 minutes of going over these types of things, throwing in Heidegger about truth and the nature of that and how science doesn't really get to it. And then I'm going to go in maybe to the next 10 or 15 minutes of this video where they're talking about the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and I'm going to bring in a little bit of N.T. Wright, because of course he's probably the most famous person to talk about the historicity of these claims. And again, there's something to them. They're very important, but they're not the entire issue. They're not the entirety of it. And I think C.S. Lewis said that it pretty much does hinge on that. Either Jesus was who he said he was, or he was a crazy guy, right? You can't have a bit of milk that's just a little bit spoiled or something. He said something along those lines. But I think there's a whole other picture here. There's the whole right hemisphere view that has to be brought in. And like McGilchrist said, a lot of this stuff originates from the right hemisphere. It goes to the left hemisphere so that you plot out all the very different materialist and evidentiary kind of things. And then the way I see it, and the way McGilchrist I believe sees it, it comes back to the right hemisphere for a final belief structure, a final way, a final disposition towards the world. And right now, McGilchrist thinks it's kind of getting stuck over in the left hemisphere. We're going too much into techne, into technology, into what we can make. This is what Ratzinger brings in, the stuff that we can make instead of truth, instead of logos. and that's the stuff that we can't make, and that's the stuff that only God can give you. Again, I'm going to bring that up in this fourth part to my Jordan Peterson Paradox video, but I think this has gone a little bit long as it is. It's going to take a long time to process. So again, thank you for listening if you've made it this far, and hopefully you subscribed if you've made it this far. Probably everybody who's already a subscriber has made it this far, but if you're not, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.